Few songs really captured the late 90s like the Lit track My Own Worst Enemy. It was a long, winding road for Lit to achieve success, and through their 30-plus year career, they changed their musical styles multiple times, they dealt with tragedy, the record label botched the release of one of their albums, and their hit song pretty much became a self-fulfilling prophecy. But whatever happened to the band Lit? That's what we're going to explore in today's video. The band's origins begin with frontman AJ Popoff and his brother Jeremy, who is 2 years older. They would hail from Fullerton in Orange County. It was at the age of 7 Jeremy would learn to play a few songs on a Hammond organ that belonged to his maternal grandfather, Ray Watson. Their grandfather was actually a touring drummer and singer playing in a jive swing band post-World War II. Their grandfather soon bought Jeremy his own organ, while he bought AJ a drum kit. Jeremy would remark to Spin, "I used to take lessons from this older lady who'd get mad at me for not reading the music and for playing everything by ear. I would see your daughter taking kids upstairs for guitar lessons, and I was super envious of those kids. They seemed super happy." Jeremy would eventually go on to become a guitarist. Their father, meanwhile, was a disc jockey who used the moniker AJ Martin in the 70s and early 80s, and he would work at the LA station KIIS FM before moving to Westwood One, where he would have a nationally syndicated radio program. He would bring home stacks and stacks of records with the Popoff's living room containing thousands of pieces of vinyl, as Baba Booey would say. Their parents would separate, and the brothers would spend a lot of time with their dad helping out at the radio station, including answering calls and also helping out with contests. The brothers would also take a liking to hard rock and metal during the 80s, being into groups like Rat, Dokken, the Scorpions, Van Halen, and Metallica. It was a concert that their father took them to when they were 8 and 10, a UFO Iron Maiden show at the Long Beach Arena, that the siblings finally realized they wanted to become musicians. They were especially enamored with Iron Maiden's performance, who at that time was fronted by Paul Di'Anno. It was in 1984 that AJ would meet a bass player named Kevin Baldus in junior high or high school. Baldus was also into the same 80s hard rock and metal that AJ was into. AJ and Kevin, by their own admission, were really not athletic or super popular in school, so music was their way of having fun. It was by 1988 AJ and Kevin would form the group Razzle. Razzle initially had Baldus fronting the group and playing bass while AJ was playing drums. They also enlisted a guitarist named Sean Holland. AJ's time, though, as a drummer would be short-lived. He only played one gig before the band decided that he should end up fronting the group. Baldus happened to know a drummer named Alan Schellenberger, who at the time was working at a Sam Goody store. It was around 1989-1990, AJ's older brother Jeremy joined the group as a guitarist. Razzle soon started playing shows on the Sunset Strip, and believe it or not, they garnered a pretty big following, even selling at places like the Whiskey and the Roxy. Keep in mind, they were teenagers at this time, and they were making good money. It was in 1993 Razzle would put out an EP, but they were starting to outgrow the music they'd previously been into. It just so happened that they got into alternative and so-called grunge music, which was popular at the time, citing Nirvana and Stone Temple Pilots as some of their biggest influences. They wanted to reinvent themselves and rebuild. They literally threw out the Rolodex of all their hard-earned contacts that they'd established up until this point, and it was now 1994. Adopting a new moniker, Stain, which was inspired by the Nirvana song, the musicians would find a rundown warehouse space in Anaheim. The lineup would be simplified to AJ on vocals, his brother Jeremy on guitar, Kevin on bass, and Alan Schellenberger on drums. They'd spend the next 6 months trying to shake their past and come up with a new sound. The band soon befriended a woman named Ruta Zepedes, who worked as an intern for hitmaker Desmond Child. As part of her job, she would frequent LA, working with producers who were also working with Child, and see bands around the city. At one show at Gazzari's in 1992, she saw Razzle perform, and she saw something special in the band and was taken aback by the massive crowd they'd attracted. It was following that gig she made her way backstage and introduced herself to the band and told them that she worked with Desmond Child, not knowing if they really knew who he was, but of course they knew who Desmond Child was. He was a prolific hitmaker, having worked with countless well-established artists like Aerosmith and Bon Jovi, to name a few. She would eventually go on to become Lit's manager. It turned out though that a band in Ohio already had the name Staind, so they had to once again come up with a new moniker. In 1995, they became Lit. The new sound the band had come up with was heavily influenced by grunge and post-grunge acts, and the majority of the audience that they had accumulated with Razzle was long gone when they became Lit. The next few years were pretty tough for the band, but they were driven to succeed. Every penny that they earned, they would reinvest it into the band, saving up for demos, posters, and equipment. They became very DIY during this period, and it wasn't uncommon to see their flyers plastered on the off-ramps and electrical boxes around Orange County. But it wasn't just hard work that helped them in their career, as luck, of course, also played an important part. One of the early gigs that Lit played was at a club where only 3 people were present, one of which was their manager. But one of the other 2 people was an A&R guy who worked for the company Malicious Vinyl. Lit soon found a home and signed to the label, and the company would release their debut record, 1997's Tripping the Light Fantastic. But the run-up to release their first album was a long, arduous process. With Jeremy telling the Reno Gazette-Journal, there was a lot of waiting around and being frustrated and disillusioned with the industry. There were so many problems with that label that the record didn't come out until April of 1997. Once the album did come out, the label, being quite small, did very little to promote it. One interview with the band seemed to indicate that their label soon went under, and Lit were now without a home. But over the next year or so, things slowly started to look up for the band. It would be an A&R guy for EMI Music Publishing named Matt Messer, who frequently visited Orange County looking for acts to sign, came across Lit when they were performing at the LA club The Viper Room. By this point, the band still weren't attracting huge crowds, and they hadn't really changed their sound. At the Viper Room that night were about 5 to 6 people, including their manager once again, but the A&R man loved the energy the band played with. He would recall seeing Lit performing the song Fireman from their first record, a performance that saw frontman AJ using a Fullerton with mallets that were on fire to bang out the opening of the song. Messer would end up signing the band to a publishing deal, and the publishing deal was advantageous to Lit because EMI had their own recording studio. This would afford the band the ability to start recording demos that they could shop around to labels. It was by the mid to late 90s, Orange County was becoming a breeding ground for punk bands, and like any scene that's becoming hot in the country, scouts from the major labels came looking. But I want to point out that Lit were adamant in numerous interviews that they didn't consider themselves part of the Orange County punk scene, and claimed that it had no influence on their sound. Lit, by 1998 or so, would make the decision to change their sound. They realized that they could still be hard and edgy, but they just wanted to simplify their songs. They would look back at the pop rock records that the Popoff brothers grew up listening to in their father's living room for inspiration. Kevin would tell an interviewer, "I don't think AJ was all excited about screaming all the time. He wanted to sing a little more. It was just a matter of taste. We all grew up on Iron Maiden and Metallica, and we grew up on Elton John and Billy Joel all combined." I also want to point out that a lot of the press coverage around the band brought up how they also looked to artists like Frank Sinatra and the Rat Pack, as well as 1950s era America for inspiration. Their grandfather turned them on to Frank Sinatra, with Jeremy even sporting a tattoo of the musician on his arm. AJ would reveal to one interviewer that the band's songs by this point were about everyday life, things like gambling, chicks, and cars, describing their day-to-day life as the movie Swingers. Lit by now were writing a ton of new songs. One of the songs written during this period would be the track My Own Worst Enemy, a song whose origins dated back to early 1998. AJ was driving a 1963 Cadillac DeVille, and he was scraping by. His gas tank meter was broken, so he had to meticulously keep track of his odometer reading, knowing that his vehicle got 8 miles to the gallon. He'd continually scribble the mileage on a paper pad, and one day while he was gassing up outside of a Circle K ahead of band practice, he heard this lyric in his head.
It's no surprise to me, I am my own worst enemy, 'cause every now and then I kick the living out of me.
AJ went to his car, got his notepad, and wrote that lyric. The next piece of the song would be that memorable opening guitar riff which Jeremy came up with. The band started to play along with Jeremy, but AJ wasn't sure what to sing. But then he remembered that lyric he jotted down at the gas bar. Based on interviews that the members gave, it seemed like the song was written pretty quickly, anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour. The studio version that Lit ended up coming up with was pretty close to the demo. In fact, AJ would recall to Spin, back in those days when we were writing a song, we would put filler words in there just to have something to sing, something to chew on while we were making it. Then we would get closer, we'd go back to those, and then we'd go in and fine-tune the words before we would demo them up or record them or whatever. But that one just took off from under us. We demoed it up the way it was because people were freaking out. The song is mostly autobiographical, admitting to screwing up, but at the same time not saying you won't do it again. Lit would premiere the song live for the first time at the Troubadour sometime in late 1998, and the audiences and even their fellow bands freaked out. Fellow Orange County band Zebrahead, who was already signed by this point in time, was at that show and would tell one of the members of Lit that the song was going to be a massive hit. Lit by this point were attracting pretty big audiences, and the label reps started showing up more to their shows. Lit would finally end up getting a record deal with RCA Records after reps for the label heard their demo and saw them perform My Own Worst Enemy. The band would head to NRG Recording Studio in North Hollywood with producer Don Gilmore, who had previously worked with Linkin Park and Eve 6. The songs were about 90 to 95% finished by this point, and RCA would issue A Place in the Sun on February 23, 1999. The title would be a reference to Frank Sinatra's old stomping ground in Vegas, the Sands Hotel. Lit's sound would see comparisons to Third Eye Blind, early Elvis Costello, and even fellow Orange County rocker Social Distortion. The band's manager would admit that payola was pretty common at this time, meaning that labels were paying radio stations to play their artists' music. She believed in My Own Worst Enemy so much, she forbade RCA from using payola to get the band's song on radio stations, as she felt it would hurt the band's legitimacy. So she asked RCA to call certain radio stations and markets to tell them that they would be getting the lead single My Own Worst Enemy early. The song would be sent to a station in St. Louis, which was in fact the first station in the country to play the song. Then by January of 1999, a month before the album's release, K-Rock started playing the song, and the label and the band were surprised at the response. My Own Worst Enemy was being played almost every 2 hours on K-Rock, and the audience was eating it up. By April, My Own Worst Enemy would top the alternative airplay charts, where it stayed for 11 consecutive weeks. Couple this with heavy play on MTV, and the song was pretty much inescapable. It soon became one of the most popular songs of the summer of '99. The success of My Own Worst Enemy resulted in A Place in the Sun going gold by June of '99 and platinum by October. It would eventually go on to sell nearly 1.5 million copies. Lit would have 2 more successful singles on the record, including Miserable and Ziploc, with them peaking at number 3 and 11 on the charts. The video for Miserable was proposed by a director who suggested that the band play on a woman's body, but they weren't really into the idea. But it just so happened that the band appeared on the TV show VIP, which starred blonde bombshell Pamela Anderson. The episode was written about Lit, who was being protected by Anderson. Lit would ask Anderson to appear in the video, which she agreed to do for free, provided that the band paid for her makeup artist, which they did. Lit would soon hit the road playing with fellow Orange County band The Offspring, and they also toured with Australian band Silverchair and Eve 6. They even had the opportunity of a lifetime to close out the year, opening for Kiss on New Year's Eve. They also played Woodstock 99, and they even played the Warped Tour and MTV's Campus Invasion Tour. On top of all this, Lit would win a Billboard Music Award for Biggest Modern Rock Song of 1999 for My Own Worst Enemy. The band's subsequent release, 2001's Atomic, saw Lit under a lot of pressure to repeat its success, and in a lot of ways, My Own Worst Enemy became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Music journalist Stephen Hayden would state on the My Own Worst Enemy podcast, "It is a double-edged sword having a song that helps define a specific time. The downside is that you define a specific time and time moves on. And what happens when you want to move on with the time, but people want to hold you in amber in this one moment in their lives?" Lit's follow-up album Atomic was born out of 70s and 80s rock, taking inspiration from groups like Boston, Foreigner, Billy Joel, as well as Ted Nugent. The 37-second long intro would see Jeremy Popoff telling Billboard, "We always want the records to feel like a live show. That's why we made a live intro to set the whole tone." The band and their label thought that Atomic was a much better record than A Place in the Sun, AJ would tell the Honolulu Advertiser, "We had a producer and label people and all kinds of people involved in the process of everything, from pre-production to song selection that weren't there before." The initial signs seemed promising though. The band had a song on the American Pie 2 and Titan AE soundtrack, and the single Lipstick and Bruises was a top 10 hit. But just as things were looking up, Lit would hit a string of bad luck. First, a lot of people who championed the band suddenly left the label in droves. Jeremy would tell an interviewer, "Our product manager, who was in charge of the marketing campaign, was fired the day after the album came out." And then one by one, people who were an important part of the team at RCA, friends who had almost become like family, were fired or began leaving for other labels. We were just kind of left on our own. Released a month after 9/11, Lit's happy-go-lucky attitude and lighthearted songs stood in sharp contrast to the mood in America, at least according to their manager. People wanted more introspective music, with the band's manager pointing to the rise in artists like Norah Jones at the time. Then their label RCA made a massive blunder. There was a coding error on the record company's part when they priced the album. Instead of being $14.99, all the records they shipped to retailers across the country said $24.99. The result was that the first week's sales were underwhelming, and soon enough RCA's offices were flooded with phone calls about why Lit's album was so expensive. When the band and their manager brought up the coding error, RCA claimed they couldn't go back to every single retailer and ask them to change the price. The record would end up selling well under 200,000 copies, a commercial disappointment. Lit was soon asked to be let out of their contract with RCA, with the label complying. The band would end up signing with a smaller label, Nitrous Records, which had a lot of industry veterans behind the company. Lit would also opt to self-produce their follow-up record, which was self-titled in 2004. The album would peak at number 113 on the album charts. It would actually be their last album to chart of their career. Then around 2003-2004, modern rock radio started changing, not really focusing on guitar-driven songs, and the band felt disillusioned by this. Jeremy soon headed to Nashville at the insistence of the group's manager, and he started working as a songwriter and producer. AJ soon moved there, as well as the band's bassist, who bought a house, and they really liked the music scene in Nashville. Then in 2009, tragedy hit the band. Their drummer, Alan Schellenberger, would pass away due to brain cancer in August. He was only 39. Schellenberger was diagnosed in May of 2008 and continued to perform with the band until fall of that year. Adrian Young of No Doubt, who Lit had toured with and who Alan became really close with, would actually fill in some dates when Alan struggled to play those shows. During his treatment, Alan would move in with Kevin, and his bandmates drove him to his medical appointments. They would be with their drummer when he took his final breaths before passing away in California. The members would admit that Alan passing away was probably the closest Lit ever came to breaking up. Their drum tech, Nathan Walker, would be enlisted to take the place of Schellenberger, and they also added multi-instrumentalist Ryan Gilmore. And they would return in 2012 with producer Butch Walker with the record The View from the Bottom, with it being dedicated to Schellenberger. Their follow-up 2017's These Are the Days would surprise a lot of people when the album was more country-inspired, but given the band's ties to Nashville at this point, it really shouldn't have been very surprising. The band went back to their roots with their most recent release coming in 2022. Lit has been pretty active on the touring circuit since then. Spin Magazine would look back at 25 years of My Own Worst Enemy, and they would claim that today My Own Worst Enemy gets played more than it did in 1999 because of multiple formats, and it still gets used heavily in tons of movies, TV shows, and even video games. I remember it appearing on disc in Rock Band 2 back in 2008. Not only that, but Spin would write that the song has been unofficially adopted by the National Hockey League as a crowd sing-along at different arenas. That does it for today's video, guys. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again in Rock Culture Stories. Take care.